evening. My name is Steven Reiner. I'm here with Professor Nancy Franklin of Stony Brook University, a professor of psychology at Stony Brook. We're having a beer. She's drinking Guinness. I'm drinking Stella. Let's toast at the beginning. We'll toast at the end. We all hold on to many things in our lives, but among the things we hold on to are our memories, our past memories, our recent memories, and certainly our memories of things that are very important to us, very special to us, and in fact, maybe even very traumatic to us. But what we know about our memory is very little, as it turns out, and we're going to hear about that tonight from Nancy. Nancy tells us, because she studied our memories a lot, that our memories are not quite what we think they are. They're a little more slippery, a little more tricky, and in fact, a little bit more intelligent than we give our memories credit for being. And among the places that Nancy speaks about this are courtrooms around the United States of America, where frequently she is called upon to testify on the issue of the veracity and the reliability of eyewitness memory. So I want to turn to Nancy and first ask you, when you're on the stand, as you are many times, what is the first question you're often asked?
The first question I'm asked is, how does memory work? So,
well, how does memory work, Professor Franklin?
Well, memory is many different things. So let me sort of give you a tour around the brain. When you are thinking about something, planning, having a conversation, the current contents of your consciousness, working memory, is housed largely here in the frontal area of your brain. When you are learning something, so presumably you'll have something permanent that you take from this, some of the facts that you learned from tonight get laid down long term. That goes through an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for turning what's in working memory into long-term memories. And then long-term memories get stored not at individual points, but as networks of interconnected neurons, largely in sort of this part of the brain. So memory is, let me start with what it's not. It's not a video camera. It's not a perfect recorder of what's around you. How memory works is that you get bits and pieces of the world in the first place. You're not noticing every last detail. And those bits and pieces that may make it in the first place, interpret it. So you fill things in, you have things be meaningful to you in some way, you interpret, and so it's really the interpretation that makes it into
So our memories are not objective. They're not inviolable, sacrosanct photographs, or as you say, video recorders of reality.
From the get-go, they're not.
We like to think they are, however.
We certainly do, yeah, and it feels that way because once those bits and pieces make it in and they're busy falling away, we are quite capable, when we try to retrieve them, of making up full stories of what it is that we're trying to remember. So we do a lot of filling in. Our memory sort of plays the odds, and so we use our knowledge and our expectations, and we wind up feeling like we have a full, complete memory.
I would hazard a guess that most of us probably think we're pretty observant and that we have pretty good memories and that we'll remember things that happened tonight. So just to sort of test that premise, I'm going to ask you to take a look at a wonderful video. Those of you who can see it, turn to the back of the room. Who done it? And let's just test our powers of observation and memory.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
And action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Well, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Nancy, what does that video tell us about our memories?
Well, it tells us a couple of things. So one is that our attention is not designed to take in every last bit of information. It would be overload, right? What we pay attention to is the stuff that matters to us. So we are attending to what the people are saying, and who cares what the butler is holding? But the second thing it tells us is how bad we are at knowing how bad we are. And that's one of the many things that make eyewitnesses potentially rather dangerous, because all juries may have is somebody who is, telling the story of what they remember and being very confident about it. And sometimes it can be a mistake to buy into that confidence.
Right. Well, that's what we want to get into now, because of course we can talk about memory and we can talk about it in the context of parlor games and other things, but the real world application, of course, is where Nancy specializes, which is in the courtroom, in the field of law. We all have come to believe that eyewitness testimony is almost inviolable, is sacrosanct. I've got an eyewitness. I'm not resting my case on circumstantial evidence. I've got someone who saw what happened. In fact, it is not as reliable as it seems. We have a legacy right now of extraordinary amounts of convictions that have been overturned because of DNA evidence, because of what's available scientifically. But what do we learn about eyewitness testimony from the overturned convictions that DNA evidence gives us?
Well, a couple of really alarming statistics. First, that about 75% of those overturned cases had eyewitness memory as a primary or the only piece of evidence against the suspect. And when you think about cases that involve DNA, those are often rape cases where you have long exposure to the other person, right? And close-up exposure. So that's actually among different crimes where you might have eyewitnesses, you'd expect among the best circumstances of seeing the perpetrator. And yet, 75% of the time that's happening. 38% of the time you have multiple witnesses making the same identification. And as it turns out, it's a wrong identification, but we know several factors that can very easily produce different people remembering the same wrong thing.
What are the factors?
Well, people's memories can become contaminated. So one possibility is co-witnesses. 86% of the time, when people co-witness an event, they talk to each other. And they can certainly influence each other's memory. Remember, memory is bits and pieces, and then you reconstruct later.
Well, if I interrupt you for a second, it's very interesting because we teach in journalism, of course, that multiple sources are better than single sources. So if you only have one source, but if you get two people telling you the same thing, it's more reliable. But you're saying not necessarily in eyewitness testimony, because there could be some contamination.
Yeah, when people are communicating with each other and sort of creating additional information that each of them can then blend into their memories. Or if they have the same source of outside information, they don't have to be eyewitnesses. I mean, anytime you have post-event information, coming in for anybody, their understanding of a situation can change.
It's also possible to literally implant memories in somebody.
Very easily.
Now, how does someone put a memory in me that didn't exist if I'm not being hypnotized?
We can get photos of you as a child, and some of this work was done by asking participants to have their parents send photos of them as children. And the experimenters then doctored a couple of the photos. So you have 3 real photos from somewhere in your childhood, and then 1 doctored one to take you from wherever you were originally photographed and place you in a hot air balloon. Okay, and then you come into the lab, you get shown each of these pictures, you're asked what happened at the time, and you narrate, the 3 real ones pretty easily. And then you get to the 4th one, and you're probably going to hem and haw to begin with. People typically do. But if we have you come back for 3 sessions and we simply ask you in each of those sessions, tell us what was going on that day. By the 3rd one, people are remembering that event. They're telling you who was there, what it felt like. They're really sort of creating a memory for themselves based on this suggestion when they should know better, right?
And
this is something
not
that
lying. They're not consciously lying.
They're not lying. No. Think about something like a crime. So, it all happens so fast, you may not really understand what's going on to begin with. There's stress, there's all sorts of things that actually make it difficult for you to encode the memory well in the first place. But then you start telling people. So you answer questions from various police officers, you tell your family, you think about it a lot. And with all of those rehearsals, as you're losing the actual original memory, you're also filling in, you're gathering details from external sources, you're making it easier to remember the event. You're putting things in the right order according to what it feels like.
Even if it's not accurate.
And it becomes more vivid. So what happens with time is greater losses and also increases in confidence. They diverge.
So I'm more confident in my memory, but my memory is not as good.
Right.
I'm more certain I've got it, but I don't.
And you often find people who, at the time of the original interview with the police officer, say, I don't remember it very well. I don't think I can identify the guy. And then by the time, a couple years later, they make it to court, they're 100% positive. And they remember themselves as always having known it.
We all like to think that if something happens to us, we get mugged, we get attacked, there's a holdup, there's a robbery. We, at least if we are lucky enough to survive, are going to have the ability, I saw the person, I saw the guy, at least I have that as a defense. I identify and point him out in the courtroom.
We're not good at that.
We're not good at that.
And it sucks that we're not good at it.
It really does. And it sucks that sometimes you're the person on the stand. And I imagine there are
Thanks.
people. Well, think about it. You frequently testify for the
Defense.
defense.
Always the defense.
Always the defense. So
never
I
been
don't
called
say
out.
it sucks in general, but for the partisans and families of those people who want the person who is being prosecuted to be found guilty, you get there on the stand and you're saying, wait a minute.
Yeah. No, I want the right guy to go to jail too, but I want the right guy to go to jail. And what we know about stranger ID is that we're very bad at it. So forget crimes for a minute. Let's talk about bringing you into the lab and you get to interact with somebody under really good lighting. There's nothing stressful, it's the ideal circumstances. And then 15 minutes later, you're asked to make an ID. So that person leaves, you get given a photo lineup. And under those circumstances, people get it right about 50% of the time. It's not impressive. We're not as good at it as we think we are. And importantly, for something like a criminal trial, if the right person isn't there, people still choose. We have a very strong tendency to pick someone, and we tend to pick the guy who looks most like the guy. And so in what's called a target absent lineup, people are still choosing someone about 25% of the time.
Meaning the lineup where the person who did it is not there.
Right, so the right answer is not there. And then we could do this without any memory requirement at all. So what we can do is take a face and leave it on the screen, and then have a lineup right underneath it, and you can take all the time you want, look back and forth. Either another photo of the same person taken the same day is present, or it's absent, right? So now do the task. And people have this sense that it's going to be a piece of cake. But again, in a target absent lineup, when you should say not there, people are picking someone a third of the time. And this is when we're doing this in the lab, there's no bad guy. There's no desire to make sure we nail whoever the right answer is.
1/3 of the time, a lineup ID is wrong.
Right. Yeah.
We went to Nancy's lab. Our assistant, Kyle, subjected herself to a little experiment. And we're going to look at the video right now, and Nancy is going to walk us through it, talk us through it, as we see whether Kyle can maintain her composure and her good memory as we try to get her a little ticked off before we subject her to a memory test.
So yeah, thank you, Kyle, for being willing to do this. Normally when people come into our lab, they get treated well.
Wait, we're not done setting up.
So my collaborator, Mike Greenstein, is doing the anger induction technique on her, making her wait outside for no good reason.
Okay, you can come in.
Hi.
There are 2 copies of the consent form. Read both of them and sign them.
Then he has her viewing several faces that she'll be tested on later. After she sees several faces, we're going to put her through a series of tasks.
We will now begin the second part of the experiment. Please press the spacebar to read the instructions. It is very important that you read them carefully.
He will harass her and insult her and put her through a couple of very tedious tasks, one of which will turn out to not be relevant.
Okay, I'm done.
Well, I just found my instructions, and that wasn't the actual intelligence test. It was for a test for a different experiment.
What do you mean? So, what was that?
It's something for a different experiment. I'm going to give you the actual intelligence test now. Please read the instructions carefully.
Are you sure this is the test now?
Yes.
Okay.
And this one is going to make her wrong no matter what she answers.
Are you still on the first question?
What am I supposed to do if the answer is wrong?
Show me.
I mean, I'm pressing the Cookie Monster for the answer.
Well, if you read the instructions carefully, you would have seen that they clearly indicate you must press a capital letter on the multiple choice questions. Why don't you try again with the shift key?
Okay.
Are you pressing the shift key?
Yeah.
Why don't we move on to the next step? I'll just write you down for a low score and we'll continue.
Wait, but I mean, this is... How am I supposed to know who that is? I wasn't even born at that point. Okay. I mean, I could feel myself, like, heating up, you know, when I'm partially embarrassed and at the same time just frustrated.
And now she gets the ID task. Which of these have you seen before, or nobody is present who you've seen before? So she should have said not there.
So what does this tell us? What is this experiment showing?
What we were interested in here was what happens after the crime. What sorts of emotions might also play into the likelihood that people are going to get it right or wrong when they get to the police station and they try to make an identification. So imagine somebody stole your wallet. Over the course of the next few days, you have to replace all your credit cards. You know, your favorite picture of someone you're never going to be able to replace is gone. You know, how dare he? And you may show up to the police station far from in a neutral mood. You know, odds are you're going to be angry. And so when you think about what anger does to cognition, it also is in service of action. You know,
I need to do something.
Exactly.
Whatever it may be.
You and I are rivals. You know, again, think in terms of evolutionary history and adaptive pressures. What's good in a situation where I'm angry is to do something that's sufficient, but not sit and pontificate and work out what the best response is. You want to, be the first guy to throw the punch. And so what we find more generally with anger is that it simplifies cognition. It's what's called an approach emotion. It makes you more inclined to do something.
But not necessarily do something that's accurate or correct.
Right. And that example that you saw of Nate, he's not a bad guy. He's, he works for a sports station or something. It's not that you're angry at the people you're making an idea of. An angry brain just is more inclined to do something and to make that ID. The second prediction we made is that in service of that, you're going to be more confident because you don't want to be in a position to second guess yourself. It's going to make you hold back.
So you're going to be wrong and you're going to be more confident that you're right.
Yes, and that's what we found.
This leaves me kind of a little despairing about our ability to protect ourselves with our memory, with our brains, with our cognition, with our powers of observation, all those things that we think at least we've got that. At least I can ID the guy, I can point out the person.
We see over and over again that people are not very good at this, and that there's all sorts of kind of pitfalls along the way, factors that tend to be present when there are crimes that tend to lead to this combination of lower rates of accuracy plus higher rates of false identifications. So I mentioned before, stress is one of those. The presence of a weapon leads to lower rates of correct ID and higher rates of false ID. Having the perpetrator wear a hat or a hoodie, it's called partial disguise. What that means is there's less of you for me to be able to match. And so there's going to be more potential people in the lineup who are good enough because I have less information to rule them out on. So false IDs go up again. Cross-race identification. Unfortunately, people are much worse at identifying members of other races than their own. And it's not an issue of prejudice. And it's, you see it in infants.
It's just the unfamiliar.
It's a perceptual expertise that people develop over time. And the expertise that you use to distinguish members of your own race doesn't then translate to other races. The features that you can use to individuate faces from each other are different in the different races. So there is psychological reality to this idea that they all look the same. They tend to look more alike for other races. And you get that same pattern, lower rates of correct ID plus higher rates of false ID. There are a lot of things about ID procedures themselves that are very suggestive. If you tell a witness, take your time, false identifications go up.
And you would think the opposite.
Yeah, you'd think
no pressure, take your time, think about this.
Be conservative.
Right.
It turns out that not only is there an implication that the right answer is present in the lineup, but the more people look back and forth, the more likely they're going to eventually talk themselves into someone because that face is going to look more familiar and more familiar and more familiar. When we recognize faces really, how long does it take? When you see your best friend, it's automatic and instantaneous. You don't have to narrow it down.
We'd be better to tell people, don't take your time. Just tell me what you think right now.
Yeah, or not to give them any sort of time instruction at all. But it is useful to note how long it takes them because people who take longer are less likely to be accurate. You can get their complete description as early as possible. Certainly don't wait until after they've seen a suspect to ask them for a description. Get their confidence rating immediately because as we know, confidence goes up with time. And one really important way that confidence tends to go up is once people have made an identification and say that they've identified the police suspect, the police then know that their suspect has been identified, and they often will then say, yep, that's our suspect. The problem is that it's the court testimony that's going to matter. So it's not that you've already got your answer. It's not that there's no worries that you're tainting someone's memory. You're giving them positive feedback, and what happens then is that the likelihood that they're going to ID the same guy in the future in a lineup or in court goes up. Their confidence goes up, and their memory of the event changes. So their memory of how well they saw the guy, for how long, at what angle, what the lighting was, all gets better as a result of feedback.
We're not, any of us here are going to be able to look at cop and lawyer shows on television quite the same way again. Do you have any idea how many trials you've testified in?
About 45.
45 trials. And you've stepped down from the witness stand in all those trials, or the overwhelming majority of those trials, feeling, I've said what needs to be said, and whatever happens, I've done my piece. In other words, you're getting up there for the defense, and sometimes there are really bad guys on that other side.
Yeah.
And they may indeed be guilty, but not because of necessarily the eyewitness testimony. I mean, it must be a tough thing to do sometimes.
Yeah, so I'm never there to speak to a particular eyewitness and say, given what I know of the case, this is my assessment of this witness. What I'm there to talk about is what we know scientifically about these phenomena. And, I'm an educator. In my view, it's always a good idea to educate.
But your testimony ultimately, inevitably, is going to be used to discredit a particular eyewitness, ultimately.
Yeah, the defense attorney is going to take what I've said and speak to the particular case. Yeah.
And sometimes your testimony has been, I would imagine, significant in terms of what the ultimate verdict has been.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the issue boils down to that we're never going to get it right in the criminal justice system. We're never going to know that the only way to always get the bad guy is to always find everyone guilty. But then we're not always going to get the bad guy. It's only if the right guy was the suspect going into court in the first place. And there's no way we're going to protect against convicting people erroneously, because sometimes the evidence against them is very compelling. And so what we can do is equip a jury with as much information as they can then use, weighing the circumstances of the testimony and of the crime against what we know about how reliable eyewitness identification and memory are.
Right. Well, this is a case of then what you learn in a laboratory has really profound real-world impact on individual lives, individual cases. So it's significant stuff. I want to throw this open to questions now, because I imagine people have some questions to Nancy. So let's throw it open. Anyone have any questions?
How good is the face recognition software that's being used today? And is it, I'm really not sure, is it used in New York State courts?
I haven't seen it used in New York State courts. I don't know that I would be told if they're trying to use it. My understanding is that it's not at that level yet, that it's not diagnostic, that it's on its way. What I have seen is people try to make identifications from closed circuit TV footage, which is basically what this software ultimately is going to try to do. My understanding is that it has flaws in the same way that humans have flaws. Wouldn't it be nice, right? Because we found out a couple of weeks ago that there were 2 people who got on the Malaysia flight with stolen passports. We know that human border guards and passport checkers aren't good at this, and they're trained. The rest of us aren't good at, 2 faces next to each other, are they the same? People make errors with that about 25% of the time. So we'd love to see software that beats that. Stay tuned.
Okay. A former student.
Did you ever have a personal experience that made you question your reliability for memory? And if so, could you share it with us?
All the time. Yeah, all the time. So I have the same architecture as everyone else, but I'm held to a higher standard, so I'm embarrassed more. So let me do actually a flashbulb memory that I just think is really interesting, because you'd think, actually I haven't explained what flashbulb memories are.
Right, that was one thing I forgot to ask you about.
Yeah, so flashbulb memories are your memory of hearing about September 11th or the Kennedy assassination.
And we all say, I know what happened in the
explosion.
moment, right?
Yeah, those memories that are highly emotional, that feel seared into memory. And you know, you have a very strong confidence, if nothing else, than in those. And they're never wrong, right? So there's a Court of Appeals case in New York State that really started this ball rolling 7, 8 years ago, where eyewitness identification and memory experts are now routinely allowed to testify in courts in New York because of this famous Legrand decision, the Legrand case. And the Legrand was the defendant in a murder case. And I kept hearing about that decision as I was being asked to testify, but I'd never really learned anything about the circumstances. And then at some point, an attorney asked me to read the brief, the appellate decision. And the first page described the event. And it was a murder that had taken place outside my window in the early 90s when I was living in New York. And I immediately recognized it as that one. And I have an ex-husband who lives in California, and I emailed him and sent him the text from that and said, do you remember this? And he wrote back and said, oh my God, that's our murder. And then he, and then he said, I'll never forget. And then he said a bunch of details that I disagreed with every last one of them. He said, you went down to the street and you asked the police what was happening. And my memory was I cowered. I wouldn't even go to the window. And so we shared our memories, and then we immediately believed each other, right? But we both had this very vivid, you know, set of details that if I didn't know better, I would have sworn on my mother's grave about. I mean, that's sort of how these things work.
Have there been occasions where judges have declined to allow you to testify?
Yes.
And what were those circumstances?
Well, there are two categories of reasons. One is that they don't think the particular factors that an attorney has brought me into the case on apply to the case. So if a judge doesn't believe that it's stranger ID, but believes that it's two people who know each other, they may decide that an ID expert isn't relevant. There was one case when a judge found me to be not qualified to testify, and I was told later that the reason was because I don't have a PhD in eyewitness identification.
There was such a thing?
No.
Yeah.
The other question I was going to ask you about is where large numbers of people are mistaken, or where there are mass misidentifications or misremembering of events. How do you account for that? Like that feature, I believe, in Pennsylvania, where the children all accused her of molesting them, and then it turned out she was not guilty of any of that.
The famous McMartin preschool case.
Right. Okay.
Repressed memory cases.
Yeah. Okay. So many different directions we can go with this. First, children are highly suggestible. So the McMartin case. There's also this issue, very interesting issue, and it really sort of had its peak in the 80s, where people were recovering memories of early childhood abuse, and they were often doing it in therapy. And this was and still is very controversial. But what we've found in the research on this is that when memories come back, when traumatic memories that had been not thought about for a long time come back, those are actually called discovered memories. They come back in a flood, unanticipated, unbidden. You know, you're in the bathroom cleaning the floor and suddenly, boom, you get hit with this terrible thing that happened to you when you were a teenager or a small child. Those tend to have higher rates of accuracy than the ones that are slowly uncovered or slowly produced in a therapeutic setting. So when people are in therapy, they are in a vulnerable position, they're suggestible, and one risk, it's not to say that any memory of abuse that's ever come out of therapy is wrong. I mean, we always have to be concerned about what are the risks here, but the risk is higher when it's unveiled slowly in that context.
Well, I'll give you one anecdote. When I was a prosecutor years ago, and I was doing a preliminary hearing, it was a felony exam to determine if there was enough evidence to hold the defendant for the grand jury, And I got to the usual question of, would you look around the courtroom and see if you can identify the person who robbed you? And of course, he was sitting at the counsel bench. And you looked around, and you finally saw the judge. And he pointed at the judge.
Did the judge go to jail?
You briefly mentioned disguises, and we've already established that facial identification is so flawed. Could something as simple as say, if you're wearing contacts versus wearing glasses have a serious effect on identification rate?
Yes, it can. So changes in features can make a difference. When you have external features covered, like hairline in particular, that's where you see the greatest devastation. So when we talk about disguise, we're not talking about a clown suit. We're talking about your hat, for example. But people will very often, because strangers' faces are so hard to encode, especially at the duration of time that a lot of crimes take place, they'll latch on to something. Plaid shirt, what kind of glasses are those? Tortoiseshell?
Tortoise.
Okay. So they'll remember, something easily describable, which means if he, steals your wallet and then takes off his glasses, you may not have any more of the diagnostic information that you would want to use. People very often do clothing when they make reports to police, which is unfortunate if the person isn't caught immediately. One other thing, though, that's interesting here is that if you're wearing something very distinctive, like a white knit cap, and then the witness describes that cap later on and somebody gets stopped and you get shown somebody else who's wearing that same feature, they're a sitting duck. Take the glasses.
Is there anything we can do to improve our memories? For instance, if you are naturally predisposed to remember faces, if you're an artist, are you a better witness?
No.
Whoa! Explain that.
Okay. What it takes to recognize a face is pretty basic, and artists might potentially, so people who do portraits might potentially be more attentive, but I don't know that I would expect a portrait artist to necessarily be better either, because the best way to recognize faces is holistically, not by paying attention to individual features. Yeah. So how can we improve memory? I hate to say this, but exercise. Physical exercise, yeah. I mean, you're improving your cardiovascular system. Your brain is very heavily dependent on your cardiovascular system. It's one of the many parts of your body that benefits tremendously from being fit and healthy.
Well, Nancy, this has been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank everybody. Please thank Nancy Franklin. Fascinating.
Thank you.
And thank everybody here at our host, the Stony Brook Yacht Club. Thanks very much, and thank you for coming. Good night.